but now I've remembered to record. So, hi, everybody. Welcome from sunny California. Both Angie and I are here on the Mid Peninsula. So, we're going to wait a few minutes to let people join in. But yeah, so Terrence just put the link in the press. And to remind me to record, I am recording.
Thanks, Karen.
But if you want to order directly from Bristol University Press, Terrence, if you can track down the 35% off code, that would be great. And we'll put that in the chat as well. So we'll go ahead and get going here. We've got a good crew. I see some of my folks from at least, a couple from Lewis and Clark, where my son goes to college. So glad to see you guys here. And feel free to let us know where you're from. And yeah, the 35% off code. So the 50 was for the previous one. Sorry, I'm talking to Taryn. Okay, so we're gonna get going. I'm talking to the chat. So
mine here.
Yes. So everybody, probably know me. I'm Terry Gibbons, and I'm a political scientist, and I have been working on issues of immigration, race, anti-discrimination policy, and from a transatlantic perspective for most of my career. And a few years ago, I decided to launch into this book, Radical Empathy, Finding a Path to Bridging Racial Divides. And today we're going to talk about why and how and all of that. And I am so thrilled to have the amazing Angie Coiro here today. She has been I'm not going to even ask how many years you've been doing radio and media, but she has a very, very distinguished career. And actually, we met at Kepler's Books, which is our local bookstore here in Menlo Park. And she actually did some of her recordings at Menlo College when I was provost there, and that was fun. And also, I've done at least one recording with you when we talked about immigration policy.
Yes.
But I've been to many events at Kepler's where Angie was the host and interviewer. And so I was so thrilled when she agreed to join us here today. So, Angie.
I'm totally jazzed. I'm so jazzed about this. It's funny, I have to share with you, Terry told me, oh, it's okay if you don't read the book. I'm like, are you kidding? Oh, yeah, I'm glad I read the book so we can start out here. Yes. But first, I want to put the book in the context of everything else of this genre, because there are two genres represented here. Mm-hmm. There are political books about racism that are really having a peak moment. And then there's the moment of memoir. Mm-hmm. And you combine the two of those. So tell me about the points that you wanted to bring forward about empathy, about racism, about your own experience. Tell me the power of personal stories in that.
Absolutely, because I really do believe that storytelling is the key here. And that's actually, it's through storytelling that we can develop and practice empathy. And practicing empathy is one of the, I have 6 steps to radical empathy. But, to talk a little bit more about the moment before I get into those 6 steps, I could see that there's been this long-standing emphasis on diversity training and trying to get people to understand things like unconscious bias. And I realized, it's hard to do that without empathy, right? If you can't put yourself in somebody else's shoes, somebody can give you the definition of unconscious bias and give you some examples, but it really needs to come from here, from the heart. And that's why I say the first step to radical empathy is a willingness to be vulnerable. We have to be willing to be vulnerable with ourselves first and with each other. And that's where you can really be practicing empathy, but also I wanted to connect it to what was happening. I really started working on this around 2016. And if you remember that summer, there was, again, a lot of movement with, that's when Black Lives Matter started, really. And I had an event at Menlo College where we had people coming and talking about the moment and, how we could deal with issues of race. And what really struck me was people who stood up and still told their stories. And we also I've had several experiences where I've had students, tell me their stories about what it's like. And it resonated with me in so many different ways because I have my own stories. And what I wanted to be able to do is help people understand how my stories connect to what's happening in the news, what's happening in research, what's happening in a day to day. And so I really felt like this was my opportunity as a researcher to connect what's happening to my life story in a way that would hopefully get people to understand my perspective and what it's like to be me.
Mhm. Well, and as far as the timing goes, it's not just as you were talking about since 2016. We've been in such a racial awareness window that we have to take advantage of. But
Mhm.
the other thing that's happening is that there's a great loss of empathy, and I'm going to include myself in this, where you can feel justified on for giving up on other people.
Mhm.
We've seen so much hate, uh,
Yes.
so much ugliness,
Mhm.
and you can feel that as a moment where you can wash your hands and walk away from it because you've done your empathy. It's still out there. I got other things to do. So, talk about, first of all, tell me what radical empathy is and then put it into that picture.
Right. And so radical empathy really, so let me just quickly talk through the 6 steps because we'll get that out of the way. But I already mentioned, the first step is a willingness to be vulnerable. And the reason I start with looking at yourself to mention the second step is becoming grounded in who you are. And the reason I start with those 2 points is because for me, I had to do that work. We all have to do that work because we have to understand how we all fit into this broader scheme of structural racism and, frankly, white supremacy, right? Our country was built on this, and every aspect of our lives is impacted by structural racism. And we have to understand, my neighbors aren't racist per se, but we live in a community that was built on racism because there were codes that kept people from being able to live here years ago, the way redlining, not being able to get loans, not being able to get the jobs that would allow you to live here. I mean, it's just layered, right?
Mhm.
And if we don't understand that, then and how we fit into that system, then it's very difficult to change it. I think, we need to get to the point where we can make that next level change, where we really try to break down structural racism. And we have to do it by understanding how each and every one of us, myself included, are a part of it and how we perpetuate it. And so that was a lot of the work I had to do, and willingness to be vulnerable and, becoming grounded in who I am. It's really been important to me to have that grounding because I talk about how I went through my years of cognitive dissonance in my 20s. And I felt like, and I know a lot of us go through this, but for me, it was really based on the fact that I had, I talk about how my parents, we grew up in a white city, Spokane, Washington. I didn't have a lot of Black friends. I did have some, but, I just felt disconnected not only from the Black, culture in Spokane, but also from family. We never really visited family in Los Angeles or Pittsburgh. We had occasionally we'd have some family members come visit, but when I got into, when I went to UCLA for grad school and so on, I really tried to reach out and get together with my cousins. And I eventually did visit Opelousas, Louisiana, where my mom, and I've been to visit Pittsburgh and saw where my dad grew up and went to school. And so for me, it was really important to make those connections because I felt I didn't have them growing up. So in my 20s, though, I really tried to reconcile who I was. When you grow up, people tell you that, oh, you're talking white or you're the smart kid, things like that. And so I had to finally just get to the point where, with some therapy and so on, just to be comfortable with who I am, and that yes, I can be part of the Black culture and the Black world, but also I live in work in a world that doesn't necessarily support African Americans in the way that it should. So
Yeah.
trying to come to grips with those things and to be prepared myself to create change. So, the third step to radical empathy is opening yourself to the experience of others, then practicing empathy. So I have to practice empathy all the time. And next is taking action, because it's one thing to have empathy and put yourself in somebody else's shoes, but it's a whole other thing to say, okay, what am I going to do about that? Now that I understand that that person is feeling oppressed, and I talk about internalized oppression in lots of different ways, and what's the action that I can take? So for me, the action I took in terms of responding to the internalized oppression I felt was to say, no, I'm not going to let that hold me back. and I am going to reach out and be part of reach out to family members, reach out to the community, and do what I can to help us get past the structural racism. And then step 6 is creating change and building trust. So, and that's really important. I really get into that more at the end of the book, where I talk about transitional justice and the, what I saw in Germany and South Africa.
Yeah. There's a lot to get into. I want to talk about, when you talk about coming to terms with yourself, your family background was really interesting. I'm one of those people who believes that if you can get down into the real depths of who you are and how you were brought up, almost everyone has an absolutely fascinating story. And one of the things that stood out to me about your family, they were in a position of trying to give their kids the best life possible.
Yeah.
And part of the way they internalized how to give you the best life possible included turning their backs on family members, which sounds inexplicable. So can you put those two thoughts together? What were they thinking? What were they trying to do?
Well, it's really interesting. I had a moment a few years ago. My mother passed away in 2010, and I spent a lot of time thinking about how she was raised and so on and so forth. And and then I read Isabel Wilkerson's book, The Warmth of Other Suns. And that really helped me to understand, why she left Louisiana for Los Angeles, because there's one particular story in there that talks about a doctor who left Louisiana and was, became a doctor to the stars in LA. But, it connected me with that, how so much of our family left Louisiana for Los Angeles. And so I really tried to connect with that. And, I thought about the fact, my grandfather in Opelousas, had been a sharecropper, and my mother was a seamstress in Los Angeles. And then I was a PhD, a professor. And that's what, they wanted in that, that's what, I was the hope that they were looking for. And so I could understand, my parents' motivations behind the way they raised us and so on, because they, especially my father, having been in the military. I mean, the military is all about, following the rules and being part of the group and so on. Although he certainly felt racism. There's a great picture in the book that really shows how isolated he was as an African American in the NCO school.
Yeah.
But so basically for me, it was important to develop some compassion, because I have to admit, I felt angry towards my parents, because I was like, why don't I know more of this family? And, why haven't I been more connected? But then I realized, they had their rationales, and I have to have compassion for what they were hoping and trying to do for us. So in any case, that was a big part of it, was seeing that they were just trying to do the best for us. And that's what they understood, that's what they knew, that's and frankly, for me, for all of my siblings, really, it worked out. We all had relatively successful lives, and it's been an interesting journey. But we've all also realized for us, we've tried to stay very connected. We talk every week on Zoom, and we want our kids to be connected. So we've also really encouraged our children to be more connected. And we connect with our cousins and aunts and uncles who are left, and mostly aunts. And so there are, we can move past these things, but also try to understand them.
Something struck me in your description of growing up with your family. I mean, we all know about colorism. We all know about the paper bag test. Your mother actually wanted you to have darker skin than she had. I'd never encountered that before.
Well, you have to read the book, The Vanishing Half. It's really interesting. Yeah, it talks about that. Our book club decided to read The Vanishing Half, and I was just like, oh my God, the mother's from Opelousas, Louisiana, and she lives in this fictional town that's where everybody's light skinned, and they just try to get lighter. And then the twins, one went off and married a white man, one went off and married a dark-skinned Black man, and she wanted to do that. And I was like, wow, Mom would always tell us, and I think for her it was because and I'm only guessing, I can't know what was going on when she was growing up in the 1930s, but I suspect part of it had to do with the fact that she didn't want her kids to have that ambiguity. right?
Uh-huh.
And I think being light skinned, I remember dad or one of mom or dad told us a story about one time, they were at checking into a hotel, and saw mom sitting in the car, and the guy was like, oh, what are you doing with that white woman? It's like, she's not a white woman, that's my wife. And so that whole issue of colorism just is such a deep one in our society.
Mhm.
So
I don't want to flash forward too much because we got a lot of older story to cover, but can you compare and contrast, raising your two biracial children with your parents' experience of, a light colored mother and
mhm.
what they were trying to accomplish?
um yeah, I mean, it's different. I think it's a lot different for me because I remember, so being the youngest of seven, we kind of went through a process where, like, my one of my sisters, she was dating white guys, and mom wasn't happy with that, but then she kind of reconciled to it, and then she got married to a white guy. And I remember my mom coming and telling me at some point, okay, as long as you marry a guy, it's okay, I don't care what color they are. Which of course is a whole other set of issues, because we do have LGBTQ members in the family. But it was interesting to watch that progression of acceptance, of that. And so in any case, by the time I had my boys, I feel like I'd been through a lot of developing understanding around these issues. And so for my boys, being biracial, it's very important to them to have that multicultural, identity. So, again, it's like they're kind of like me in the sense that they don't want to be pigeonholed,
Hmm.
that, oh, you're the smart kid, or you're the kid who talks a certain way, or whatever. And they want to be able to have the freedom to define themselves. And so that's what I've really tried to give them, is that freedom. And I'm certainly not going to try to impose any particular identity on them, but I really do try to give them the freedom to have their own identity, and that's what's important. But I have to give them some support in that, because I know my again, you get to your 20s, that's like my older son, and we talk a lot about these issues, and race, and so on. And and again, they're growing, they grew up in Austin, up until 5 years ago. And we've lived here for 5 years. And the both of the neighborhoods we were in, actually, I think our neighborhood in Austin was more diverse than our neighborhood here. But both of the schools they went to were pretty diverse. And so they've always had a range of friends. Actually, what cracks me up is my younger son Brandon. All his friends are in, kind of international. He has one friend whose parents are from Sweden, and French, and Turkish, and Latino, Hispanic. So he's got a whole range of friends that he hangs out with.
It sounds so healthy. It
Mhm.
just sounds so healthy.
I
Um,
think this generation is a lot more healthy about these things, although there's certainly issues, but I think they're a lot more healthy about it than our generation certainly was.
yeah. When you got into Stanford, you actually used the phrase about worrying about whether you were an authentic Black person.
Mhm.
And if someone were to have stopped you at the time, I mean, you put yourself in that frame of mind from that time and said, well, what is an authentic Black person? What definition would you have come up with?
Well, there was so that it's kind of the stereotype, right? You have to talk a certain way, you have to act a certain way, and I think the one thing that struck me at Stanford was there was kind of a group of us who would just kind of hang out with everybody. And then there, like, I think I tell the story of there was a couple girls down the hall who would always eat with them, eat with only other Black people. So you've sure, yeah, I talk about the book, Why Do All the Black Kids Sit at the same table? And so that was really interesting to think through, what we're, and so actually it was really great for me to read that book, because I got a much better understanding of, what that was like for those kids coming from more, predominantly Black neighborhoods, and church. I was raised Catholic, churches, communities. And so having that the ability to hang out with other Black students was important to them. They needed that. And although at the time for me, I felt like I needed to be, it's funny because it ties in with kind of what my parents wanted, is I needed to be part of the broader, dorm, and to have my friends, and not necessarily define them by race. And what I think we have to get, and what I had to get to, and what we all have to get to, is to let, basically we just have to let people be who they're going to be. And I was the kid who I mean, my friend Jamie is on here from, we both grew up in Spokane, and she happened to live down the hall from me, and we became best buddies after that, because we both grew up in the same town, even played volleyball against each other. And so having that freedom to choose your friends and so on, without worrying about a lot of this overhanging stuff. And I think that's the goal, right? Is we want to be able to just have empathy and understand each other, but also just to allow ourselves to be who we are. And I spent a lot of time kind of going into that, because like I said, we want to put people into boxes. And so I spend a lot of time in the book kind of talking about this idea of how we all feel this pressure of stereotypes and so on. And so I think for me, back in, when I started at Stanford, I had a very stereotypical perception myself, and I had to really work out of that and understand that, I mean, there's actually, our dorm at Stanford was pretty diverse as well. We had a really interesting group of people, and nobody really, it was better not to try and categorize people, basically.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
You mentioned Spokane, and so I want to go into your backstory a little bit more, because your parents went to Spokane deliberately because it was more peaceful. There were race riots going on. It's all kind of tension, and
mhm.
they felt that Spokane would be a more peaceful, safer place for you to grow up.
Mhm.
So I'd love to know what your perception was of the violence going on elsewhere. And in fact, if I want to back up even further from that, 1968, you said that when Martin Luther King was assassinated, you really didn't talk about it at your house. So what
Mhm.
was your perception about what was happening in the rest of the country about racism?
I had no perception. That's what's interesting. But so I really didn't gain a perception, even though, we would watch the news and so on. I didn't gain a perception until I got to elementary school. And, you can imagine today in general, we don't do a good job of teaching Black history or the civil rights movement. So what I did was, it's interesting. I was reading a story today about curiosity. I was always curious. So one of the things I remember is, and I can't remember which year it was, but when Barbara Jordan spoke at the Democratic National Convention, that had such a huge impact on me. So the fact that I got to be at UT Austin, where she was a professor, and all that I loved the fact that, I got to be involved in some activities at the LBJ school, but I'm getting off on a tangent. But so watching, strong women figures like Shirley Chisholm and Barbara Jordan and so on kind of opened up my eyes to the broader things that were going on around the civil rights and movement and so on. And so I started reading. I'm a huge reader, and my mother, would always, have to, I think it was 76. She always saying 1976, I think was that um, uh, Democratic convention with Barbara Jordan. But in any case, basically I grabbed every book out of the library I could about Martin Luther King, about Jackie Robinson. I ran track, so I was really into, some of the different runners and so on. And box, Muhammad Ali was a huge figure at the time. And so, I guess my really learning about that started more when I was in elementary school, and trying to gain an understanding of it. But we just didn't talk about it a whole lot, and so it was, and if you were around back then in the late 60s, Martin Luther King was not a popular figure. It's interesting to see how he's been transformed. But yeah, it's really interesting.
Some of the narratives, it's funny because you did mention, I think it was the Smithsonian that reports that he had a disapproval rating like 73, 76%. And of course,
Exactly.
now it feels like, oh, he was always embraced. And some of the narratives that grow up around these stories are interesting to me. And you posit yourself throughout the book. You're not only a Black woman, you're a Black woman.
Mhm.
And some of the narratives around women in racial progress, Rosa Parks, for some
Mhm.
reason, was more acceptable to us as a woman who was just tired and
Mhm.
refused to move. And of course, that wasn't the case at all. I mean, this was
Yeah.
strategic. She was an activist. And for
Mhm.
some reason, it was easier for us to take the story that this was some poor woman who just had tired feet.
Oh yeah, she is a seamstress and she was tired and didn't want to get up. And it's just like, no, and it's funny, this story really has just been coming out, I think in the last 5-10 years. It's not, and so, the kids for so many years have been learning in school. Oh yeah, she was just tired and didn't want to get up. It's like, no, she was, and not only was she an activist, she was assisting women who had been raped and so on, and it was, an amazing, her story is so amazing when you
Mhm.
really get the full of it. But that's, it's the way that we tend to try to sanitize history, right? And that's why so many people are trying to, I think the 1619 project is important component of that. And there's so many people out there, and researchers and historians and so on, who are trying to really get the real stories out there. But we're even seeing it in, the film, right? There's a lot of films we've been watching, a lot of uh, the films that, like the One Night in Miami, it's fictionalized, but still it's really interesting to learn more about what happened, because the stuff that they show that happened after the fictional night is real. So
Mhm.
so some of this is really interesting to rethink and to look back on, and a lot of female figures are really coming up now, like Nina Simone and her activism. And there's a new movie coming out about Billie Holiday as well, who the FBI went after her, and
Yeah,
so yeah.
yeah, all these hidden stories.
Hmm.
What lessons did you take away about the narratives of being a young Black woman when you went out into the world? What did you find out that you had to probe about what you had internalized, not just about being Black, but about being a woman in competitive situations, in academic situations? What did you have to deal with?
Well, I had to really think about how I felt like I was trying too hard to fit into the system. As those who know me know, I left academia a few years ago. And part of it had to do with my realization, and this probably happened around 2010. I remember because it was right after my mother had passed away, and I really start realizing that, not everybody has my best interest in mind, not that that's ever true, but um thinking through what I really wanted from my career. And, I realized that in many ways I'd kind of been fighting against taking on, the issues around social justice and so on. But that, it was okay to work on those issues. And so I started off by, I started my own organization. But anyway, the main point to answer your question is that um, I just started to come to this realization that I did have my own internal capacity to address these issues in a way that maybe others didn't. And so that was important to me to step out and not just be part of the system. And academia is very hierarchical and structured, and all of this. And part of it had to do with being disappointed by some people who kind of let me down, but it was also my own realization that I had to be not only my own best advocate, but an advocate for others. And not that I hadn't been doing that already, but to really take that on in a way that would allow me to hopefully make some change in the system. So I always tell people, I feel like I could do more outside of academia than I could inside. But
Mhm.
I also see that, academia, there's some change happening, not enough. So there may be other ways that I can deal with that. But the realization to me was, right in that time period, around 2010, where I decided that I was going to have to leave academia to change it.
Mhm. Mhm. You devote a whole chapter to finding love.
Oh gosh, here we go.
Yeah, this was fun. But one of the things that you go into in that you go into this examination about the commonalities you have to find in a partner. In your
Yes,
particular case, you found yourself kind of hiding your education because that was a turnoff for some of the Black men that you encountered.
not just
And
Black men, but
not
yeah.
just Black men, yeah. You find out that with Black men, that
Mhm,
made it even more difficult.
mhm,
And you talked about first, you laid out the case of here's why it's so hard to cross barriers when you're looking for a partner. But then you express optimism that it really can be done.
Oh yeah.
So if we know that it's hard to look at another class, it's hard to look at another color, how do you expand that definition of who's an appropriate mate?
Well, it depends on the person, right? I mean, so what was most important to me was finding somebody, excuse me, who shared my values. And it's funny because I look at my relationship with my husband as kind of being a yin yang. We're not the same by any stretch. We're very different, but the ways we're different are complementary. And so, it's interesting because I was having a discussion about a week ago about interracial relationships with a group of folks. And, there was a guy who was saying, oh, I was, he was here in the San Francisco Bay Area and he had a PhD and, he was trying to find, these women, all these women saying they couldn't find a man. And I was there like, well, we didn't meet. I'm sorry. So, I don't want to say that it wasn't possible to find, a match with, I tried for many years to find a match with an African-American man, but it didn't work out. And I met Mike and it was magic. And Jamie, who's on here, knows the whole story. But, really it was, beyond just, the initial attraction, it was, the fact that I knew he would, that he wasn't intimidated or didn't feel, he was happy to support me as I was out there doing my thing. He's an engineer. He sits here on his computer. He's, I'm the one who's out there marching and giving, doing stuff like this, writing books, giving talks, being the vice provost. He was always, it's funny when I was at UT Austin, we would, oh gosh, Jamie says you can reach out to her for the dirt, and Rhonda. You guys will get your chance later. But it was really interesting as we kind of got to know each other better. And, we both love to go. We both love, actually, jazz was one of the things that brought us together initially. And then we both love camping. We still go camping. But, the most important thing to me at the time was somebody who was a real partner. I knew I was going to have a very high powered career, as an academic. I actually, right when we got together, I decided to go back to graduate school. And, but I also knew we wanted kids. And so if we were going to have kids, that meant that we were, he was going to have to play a big role. And so we talked about that a lot before we got married. And I said, look, you're a pianist. I'm going to have to travel. You're going to have to be very involved with the kids. And he didn't have a problem with that. And he's never had a problem, and not that a man should, but sometimes they do. And so for me, it was really the whole issue of finding somebody who was supportive and and I have to be honest, I'm not the kind of person who it takes a lot of nurturing in the sense that my sisters know we all tend to be very independent minded. But to have somebody who can do the nurturing when necessary. Yeah. So I'd gone out with guys who just wanted to be really protective and all. It's like, I don't need that.
I can't see anybody doing that with you.
No, I'm yeah, not that I don't need nurturing at all. I do, but I want a partner. I want somebody who's my equal. And from the intellectual sparring to the physical activity, we go out and do these 15-mile hikes and have to be able to keep up with each other. And
that goes to something else that you give a lot of play in the book, and it's very important, and that is healthcare discrepancies and healthiness, fitness in the Black communities. And you use your own father as an example here.
Yeah, I hope I start the book with that story.
Yeah. And it's not uncommon for the signs of a heart attack, early signs of a heart attack, to be ignored. That's universal. What ties into that has definite racist components is access and information and education and being taken seriously as a Black person in issues of health. So can you expound on that, how it played out in your own family?
Yeah. So, when my father had a heart attack, as the researcher, the first thing I did is start digging into, and he passed away from that heart attack. There was no precursor, although there was a point where he probably did have a cardiac event and we didn't know what it was. But in any case, after I started doing all the digging, I realized just being an African American male is a risk factor for heart attack, which just I couldn't believe it. And then the more I learned, the more I realized, why hadn't my father had the stress test and all these other things. And I think, the more I learned about just our healthcare systems and so on, is that, and even talking to my friend who's a doctor, it just everything around it, we have to be very careful as African Americans, because one of I remember the moment when I was driving around in Berkeley one day, and I heard the story on NPR that was talking about how Black women, regardless of class or wealth or education, are more likely to have poor maternal and fetal outcomes. And I was just like, wow, that's crazy in this day and age. That just being Black is a risk factor, and it doesn't matter how. I mean, Serena Williams is the perfect example of this. And so I was so blown away by all of this, and really got me to thinking more and realizing that we need desperately to have change in the way we deal with these things. I mean, it's one thing to have the blatant police shootings, but just to know that in everyday life, just the simple act of going to the doctor, or to needing health care, and obviously a heart attack is not simple, but still, it's
you found,
just.
by the way, everybody may not know the Serena Williams story. So can you?
Oh, right. Yeah. So
Yeah.
Serena Williams, when she had her child, afterwards, she could tell that something was wrong. And she kept telling her doctors and nurses, look, something's wrong. This is not right. And so finally they paid attention to her, and she had I'm going to forget the name of it, pulmonary embolism, but a blood clot that could have killed her if they hadn't caught it in time. And so, yeah, and so that was a wake up call. And then there was several articles in the New York Times talking about poor maternal outcomes. How some women died in childbirth, despite the fact that they were healthy, and so on. And of course, obviously, we're seeing the situation with COVID, where African Americans are more likely to get it and more likely to die. And now we're having difficulty getting the vaccines to the right communities. So I'm actually working on that with some folks here. I know my friend Amy's on, who's trying to make sure we get the word out to the different communities here to make sure they have access to the vaccines. But that, all of these things, that's why I say, structural racism is just endemic. It's part of every aspect of our lives. And it's really important that we understand that. So it's not, because the reason I really get into this in such detail is because we need to understand that it's not just pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, right? My success is partly due to my parents and what they did for me, and of course all my hard work, but there's always barriers, and we have to figure out how to tear down those barriers in a way that we all understand, because we can't be the only ones seeing those barriers, meaning us, Black people and people of color and so on. Everybody has to see the barriers so we can tear them down. And that's why empathy is so important, right? You have to be able to understand, how horrible it was for us to lose our parents to heart disease when, they should have had access to better care, and how awful it is to lose, other family members, cancer, all kinds of different things that, there's clearly bias in how people are treated.
Mm-hmm. The one that blew me away in the book that you mentioned, tell me if I'm remembering this correctly, that when you were dealing with endometriosis, your doctor, who finally took you seriously, told you that there are people in his profession who don't believe Black women get endometriosis. What?
Yep.
How does that even figure?
They're Black. It's I have a site in there about how a really high percentage of medical students think Black people can't feel pain the same way that white people do.
Just amazing.
Yeah, I know. Some of the stuff I uncovered when I was doing this research was just I couldn't believe it. But but then that's why I connect it to my personal stories, right? Because then those stories start to make sense. Unfortunately, so that when I understand that there are all these doctors out there, like this doctor who died from COVID recently, she was on video begging her doctors to give her and nurses to give her pain medication, and they were trying to get her to leave the hospital when she was needed help with breathing and so on. So it's interesting because my doctor friend and I have kind of come up with a checklist of things that doctors should have to go through. And so, yeah, Tarrant put the quote in there: half of white medical trainees believe the myth that Black people have thicker skin or less sensitive. I mean, it's just ridiculous.
You'd think of people who would believe in science, you would start with doctors.
You would think. But that's why I say we all live in the sea of white supremacy. So for doctors, white is normal, and Black is something else, and Hispanic is something else. And so that's why we have to be intentional, and make sure I use the word intentionality a lot, because we all are swimming in this, right? We all have this to deal with and have to remind ourselves. And so if we're not intentional about dealing with these issues, then we aren't going to get change. And yeah, so thanks to Christina and Joseph for your comments, because it just shows that these things are it doesn't matter that my parents were middle class, and they still got poor treatment when it came to their health care.
Let's talk about injecting radical empathy into conversations about race. And I think you gave a very important quote in the book, and this was Patricia Roberts Miller. She said, racism isn't about intent or whether people have their feelings hurt. Racism is about actions, policies, structures, practices, systems, institutions that reinforce the racial hierarchies of a culture.
Right.
When you tell a person that they, by virtue of being born in America, by virtue of being born here, we've learned to other people, ergo we are racist. We will other people on the basis of race. They don't look at a definition like Roberts Miller's definition. They look like, you're telling me I'm a bad person. It's so, there's such a catch-22 trying to get people out of that. And what I often see is a white person seeking information yet again from a Black person who's had it up to here with explaining the world to white people, and you can't get anywhere. It really is a catch-22. So take that picture and put radical empathy into that picture for me.
So the reason I start, that's why I start with the individual. Okay, so going out and reading Robin DiAngelo's book is not going to fix things. You read the book, you feel guilty, okay. What you have to do is look inside and really understand. That's why I tell people, people, what can I do? What can I do? And by the way, at the end of each chapter, there is activities you can do, and we also have a reading guide that lists the various activities by chapter and different readings you can do. But the one thing I tell people is start with your neighborhood. If you want to start doing that internal look at where you live and why you live there, where you grew up, and why does the place you grew up look the way it does. I mean, African Americans have been here for 400 years. Why is it that we aren't more widespread? You can look right here where I live. East Palo Alto used to be the place. One of the interesting things about this area, actually, I discovered when I came back to work at Menlo College, is I started looking at the data, and in 2005. African Americans were 7% of the population here in this area of the peninsula in San Mateo County, and they dropped down to 2%. And so that was really stunning to me. And so, yeah, it's really important that we keep in mind that this is, again, the structures are there, and we have to change policies. And actually, I'm talking to the folks here in Menlo Park about trying to do more about that, because we don't have we need a diversity task force to look at race, usage of race. And we just did a session about the color of law that talks about racial segregation here in this area, and how the different laws. So it is laws, have created what we have today.
Yeah. There's a sub narrative, there's a subtext to a lot of times when you talk about trying to achieve racial equality and trying to achieve racial justice. There's a zero sum game mentality that you come up against,
Mm-hmm.
which might be easier to confront if it was overt, but it's subtext in a lot of cases. If I give you something that I have, I will lose part of that. If
Mm-hmm.
I give you equal access to jobs, I'll lose access to jobs. If I give you reparations, I'm going to have less. And how do you tackle that?
Well, the reality is, basically we can lift all boats, but the reality is that we have to, people have to understand it's not a zero sum game. And actually, there's a really good book that just came out. I think it's called The Sum of Us. And I can't remember the name of the author. I should have brought that with me, but Taryn will probably look it up. But it literally, yeah, it literally just came out, and it's like an economic take on this issue, right? Of if we give, jobs and opportunity to this group, it doesn't mean that this group is losing. The reality is we all do better. And so Karen's right on top of it. She's got the link to the book. And I think that's a really important thing to understand. Now, there are some things that are zero sum. When I take the job as provost at Menlo College, that means a white male doesn't have it. But guess what? I'm probably going to help a lot of people who will then help that white man do better in his career, in his life, right? There it's not as so we have to help people to understand that it's not a zero sum game, and that this country has always had we're an engine of growth when we all work together, and there's no reason we can't continue growing. In fact, I think Heather McGee's book really talks about the fact that we're actually holding ourselves back by not allowing, because think of all the productivity, all the creativeness, all the things that there's a really interesting another I was listening to a podcast, and one of the women on there was a neuroscientist at Stanford, and she was saying, we have to what she's learned in her research is that everybody has capacity. That she's even moving away from this idea of growth mindset, because we can all learn. So we have to get away from this idea that there's a hierarchy, that some people can learn and some people can't. Everybody can. And if we understand that, then it really changes the way we approach education and learning, and how we interact with people. But anyway, a lot of stuff in there. But I think, if we want to jump to some of the questions that we have been getting.
Well, first, I want to commend Shelley first, because she pointed out that what we're talking about is not a pie here. There's X
Right.
amount of pie, and once one person gets too much, that's a great visual. I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
Amy's asking, how do we keep the younger generation from becoming complacent? I want to break that down into a couple of components. Do you think the younger generation is getting complacent? And if you do think that is an issue, then how do you deal with that?
My only concern there in terms of being complacent is I sometimes I think they feel like the issues aren't there, even though they see them. I think it's easy when you're young. I admit this. When I was young, I felt like, oh, I can't be touched by that stuff that's happening over there. And so I think it's important to be honest with our youth and make sure they understand, obviously, that we love and support them, but that there are issues that we all have to grapple with. And so I'd say there's a lot of youth who are very, in touch with what's going on and are out there doing the work. And not all of them are going to do that. So we have to keep that in mind. It's a question of what they want to do and how. And I think that actually, I'm really not that worried about complacency, because I just see so much going on with young people. I'm on college campuses and I have my own sons, and I really do feel like there is this ongoing push, and I think they're really pushing us to change. And I think that's when they see what's going on, and I do really think that my son's generation really wants us to change. They feel like they're more understanding and more connected, but that we need to do more.
There's a great story around that. You mentioned in the book Clayton Carlson from Stanford.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, he's a world famous
Yes.
educator in equal rights, in racial equality.
My professor when I was at Stanford.
There you go. Well, I interviewed him. I had a couple of years ago.
Yeah,
I
no,
interviewed him.
I was there with the guy who it was something about the South.
Yes.
That's
Yeah.
one of your events I went to. Yes.
And he was talking about, I really enjoyed this with him. And he was talking about trying to bring younger people up with empathy and understanding and the ability to confront injustice. And then he got stuck
Mhm.
on the bridge one day because the kids over near Stanford were protesting and they were in the streets and they were fighting for equality. And he had this double-edged moment where he's saying, on the one hand, I'm not going to get where I'm trying to go here. That's a little irritating. On the other hand, they're doing exactly what I told them to do. So there's your disconnect. I thought that was a great story from him.
Yeah. And actually, I want to address Joseph's question. He's asking, can you talk more about how empathy can link to action? Because that's an important point. And yes, absolutely. Empathy. Actually, that's the whole point of radical empathy, right? Is action. And so one of the things I tell people when they're starting to do that inner work, first you would do the inner work, but also look around you, get out of your comfort zone. We probably shouldn't have gone, but a year ago we went to Lunar New Year because I'd never been, and I wanted to understand something different. I do try to kind of reach outside of my comfort zone to learn about other cultures and so on. And so I think one of the things that's important in terms of taking empathy to action is, you want to have understanding, but then you have to, it's easy to stay in your comfort zone and have empathy, right? You just,
Right.
okay, well, I want to understand how this person feels, so I'm going to read this book or I'm going to hear this story. But to get out of your comfort zone is to actually figure out what is something I can do. And like I said, there's at the end of every chapter, there's actions. But one of the, like I said before, one of the simplest things is to start understanding what is the story of your neighborhood? What is the story of where you live? And that's something that when I moved back here to the Bay Area 5.5 years ago, I really did start kind of digging into, what's the history of, even though I was at Stanford for a while and I even lived up in Redwood City, I never really knew what was the history of this area. Why does it look the way it does? Why do we have all these, most of these peninsula towns, tend to have really weird borderlines, like I actually don't live in Menlo Park. I live in the county,
Yeah.
but Menlo Park is just across the street, So it's really interesting to start to understand why things are the way they are. And a lot of it is connected to race and you trying to keep people out or letting only certain people in. So
Yeah.
anyway, so action comes from knowledge, understanding, and yes, as Rhonda says, it's even good to look at who were the indigenous people who occupied the land. One thing I love about doing talks in Canada, the Canadians were the ones I think who started this, where you do the land acknowledgement at the beginning of a talk. And so I make an acknowledgement to the Ohlone, whose land we are living on. But it's important to and what I've noticed too is like when you go to parks and things, they start to make those acknowledgements and connecting to the history. So a lot of it is about education. And so really, I guess the first step is, besides doing the internal work, is educating yourself and then taking action. And taking action can take a lot of different forms, and we all have different levels of comfort. And I do say you have to get out of your comfort zone, but some people don't have the capacity to go march, but you can write a letter to your congressperson,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And that's, I want to make sure we talk about policy change. We really have to see policy change that is going to not, I actually like, I used to be somewhat, I wasn't quite sure what to think about reparations, but there's different ways to do reparations that really could lift people up. And so I actually am becoming more and more a fan of reparations. And that's one thing that I think we could all start thinking about, what are some ways to do reparations?
That's going to be more in the discussion now. It's going to be more
absolutely
in the dialogue because I just saw the headline. I didn't have time to read the story, but apparently in their first podcast, Bruce Springsteen and Barack Obama said, frankly, he thinks reparations are appropriate.
Well, when what was it, David Brooks said was for reparations, I knew that the tide had turned.
White guys.
Yeah. I want to come to Mylisha's question because so how do you safely address somebody about radical empathy without making them feel like you're accusing them of being racist? And that's why it's funny, because I remember I was talking to somebody, and or we were having a webinar. I used the term white supremacy, and one of the guys came to me afterwards and was saying that it really made on the defensive when I use the term white supremacy, because when you say white supremacy, people think of Ku Klux Klan, people in burning crosses, but that's not what we're talking about. White supremacy is the structure we live in.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it is important sometimes to you don't want to put, I guess my approach is trying not to put people on the defensive, even though I use terms like white supremacy, because I'm trying to say that we all have internalized oppression. We all have internalized this bias. And so if we don't acknowledge that, then we can't, get to a greater understanding. And so to safely address somebody without making them feel racist is to start telling your story.
Mm-hmm.
Don't tell them you have unconscious bias. And that's why I don't like a lot of this training, because it's like, here's unconscious bias and you have to fix it. It's like, no, tell them your story. So Myleisha, I think that you could just start, instead of, just tell them what your life is like, tell them your story. That's what I did with this book, is I decided that it was important for me to be able to tell my story. So storytelling is a really, really critical component. So yeah, and then if you don't mind, come back to Shelley's question, which is
Yeah.
one of my pet peeves is when people say I don't see color, they aren't personally racist or don't believe they are, and that's enough, when that in fact is completely dismissing the actual experience and reality of Black people. How can one help move the needle with people like that, or people who don't even see their own inherent privilege? In other words, not blatant racism. And that, actually that's exactly what I'm talking about. Shelley, is first of all, I want people to see my color. I'm very proud of my color. So when people tell me they don't see color, it's like, you don't see me then.
Yeah. And the science is against that. The science finds that an infant,
Yes.
within months, can make a distinction between people of his own color and another color. I mean, that's just human beings. We learn immediately what we fit with.
And to answer Shelley's question, the way to respond to it is to say, well, you're basically making that person invisible by saying you don't see color, right? Mm-hmm. You're totally erasing their life experience, because we are all totally impacted by the way we deal with color in this country, right? Mm-hmm. It's not that, obviously, race doesn't exist. It's a social construct, but that social construct has more power in this country than almost any other thing. I mean, the whole and we focus so much on the Black-white divide, and obviously it's really important to focus on the divides. We have so many, there's intersectionality, being a Black woman, but there's all different kinds of intersectionality, as well as Asians and LGBTQ and so on. So imagine, would you tell somebody, it's like saying you don't see the clothes they're wearing. We all wear clothes to because our clothes signify something, right? That beautiful fuchsia scarf, which I want to steal from you, except that your cat has put holes in it. I see that fuchsia scarf, and to me that signifies something. I wouldn't tell you, oh, I don't see color, I don't see your fuchsia scarf.
Yeah. I think it's a place of comfort for people. I think it's so much easier to say, well, I don't see that, because if you see it, you have to contend with it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so Shelley, but the answer is, they think it makes them not racist. No, we're not saying that you're racist because you see color. I mean, for God's sake, we're just saying that we all have to understand what that means underneath. Mm-hmm. And Bubba Wallace said he didn't see color. Yeah. It's like, no, sorry, Bubba, we all see color. It's scientific fact. But some people it's like when I was studying France, in France they always say that we don't see race and so on, and yet the poor Algerian and Black kids are the ones who always get picked on by the police. There was a study, or a journalist who embedded himself in the police in France and in a poor neighborhood, and it was just a culture of going after these kids. And I saw that myself when I was in France. So
let's talk a little bit about I want to talk about the role of art. And this is not how you posited it, but you integrated it. You were talking about the different memorials to
Mhm.
what's happened, the ugly
Mhm.
things that have happened because of race. And you talked about little stumbling blocks in Berlin where you could
Mhm.
just be walking to the store and you look down and here is where Jewish people got dragged to the trains. You
Mhm.
know, here is where, you know, stores were broken into. And it integrated that experience into your day-to-day life because you look down and there it is. And you talked about walking through a lynching memorial to all of
Mhm.
those who've been lynched. And I just want to address that the power that art has to convey to us the whole of the picture that we're looking at.
I know that memorial. I have to tell that story for those who weren't here. I talked about it at the noon webinar, so I have to talk about it here. So the story there is I was doing a tour. I talked to a friend of mine at University of Alabama into inviting me out to give a talk with night, and so I decided I was going to do a tour of all the main civil rights places in in Georgia. And actually, I didn't realize you go to the University of Georgia campus, and there are all these Civil War signage and how this battle happened here. I was like, wow, so I was actually learning a lot. And then I stopped in Atlanta and did a couple talks there and stopped at the Martin Luther King Center and so on. And then we met up with my friend at University of Alabama, and he took me to Birmingham. And the amazing thing to me was that, and and for those who have to go, I understand, but we're going to keep talking. The the place. So you remember seeing the pictures of the fire hoses and the police with the dogs and all that. Well, that happened in this park that was just a square block. And you don't real and right there across the street is the church where the 4 little girls were killed from a bomb. And there's the statue of commemorating the lives of the 4 little girls. And then right across there is this civil rights center and museum. And it's just fascinating. I mean, and you walk or you do a little circuit around the park, and it talks about some of the different events that happened there. And it was just wow, it just blew me away. And so then we went down to Montgomery to the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. And for those who haven't seen it, so basically when it opened, that April, I was like, I have to go there. Something told me I had to go there. And so my friend Uch takes me, and it's the setup is it's outdoors, and it's got pillars, and each pillar is a county where there were lynchings. And so we got there, and my interest was mainly I just want to see this thing, and it really seems like an impactful piece of art, as you're saying. But when I got there, I was started walking through, and I'm like, wait a second, what if there was a relative who was here? And I just got this kind of premonition and sick feeling in the pit of my stomach. So we're going through, and I'm like, well, Mom grew up in Opelousas, so what was the county or parish where she lived? And it was St. Landry. And so we get to St. Landry Parish, that column, and there's somebody named Julian Stelly on it. And I was just, holy crap. So I look him up with the magic of a smartphone. And, he was from nearby Opelousas. And, in 1898, he was killed by the Ku Klux Klan because he was out trying to register people to vote. And so this, huge artwork to in memorial to lynching had so much power. I mean, my heart stopped when I saw that. I was just like, wow. And there were other pieces of art there that really, it was interesting because this was before the hands up, don't shoot thing. Well, it was around, actually it came after, but it was this piece of art. I posted it before on Facebook, so some folks might remember it, but that was a just people kind of encased in cement, but you could see their heads and arms, hands up. And I thought that was very impactful. So art is so impactful. And the way that they did this memorial and so on just really had a huge impact on me. And again, it's a way, art and the way we do these memorials is a way to gain empathy.
Mhm.
Right. So people who may not, it's yes, exactly. As Barbara says, it's storytelling.
Yep.
And so it's really important that we understand these stories and that these stories are told. And you'll notice now, in film and art and museums that we really are trying to do more storytelling. So people understand. It's like, exactly, it's like going to Auschwitz, I can say that, and not feel that it was, I mean, for me, going to the Holocaust Memorial again was one of those things that I found really impactful. So I think it's important to understand the history, but to feel the history through art and memorials is a different thing.
You know what I always like to say as a last question when somebody's dealing with some very deep and difficult topics,
Mhm.
what's the thing that gives you the most hope?
Oh boy. Love. Yeah, the thing that gives me the most hope is, despite all that we've been through, is we still are able to love each other and to I mean, what keeps me going and what has kept me going through this pandemic, besides being here with my husband and my son Brandon, and at times my son Andrew, we obviously we love each other, but that love of family, keeping connected with my family, and I try to make it a point to reach out to different friends at different times. And there have been various situations where whether it's just a phone call or a Zoom call or whatever it may be. And so that we have the capacity for love tells me that we have the capacity for empathy. And when I think about, somebody asked the question, unfortunately she had to leave, or she was here this evening as well, about what do we do about the 75 million people who voted for Trump. And that my Christian Catholic upbringing comes into play, and it's like, well, it's hard, right? And we're not going to get along with everybody, and having empathy for those kinds of people is really hard. And I don't say you have to have empathy for everybody. And certainly, some of us who've been on the receiving end of the violence and so on don't have to do that. But we do have to maintain love and that connection in our lives. And I think that's what keeps us going.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to everybody for joining us today.
Shelley, thank you for noticing my action figures. I've got Kamala Harris on the way, so.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. This was really fun. And
congrats on the book.
Yes, thanks so much. And we'll, you guys can always find me on Facebook and Twitter and all of that. So, make sure you tell all your friends about the book. And we're also make sure you tell all your friends that we are doing workshops with different organizations and trying to spread the word about radical empathy. So, send them our way if they're interested. Thanks, everybody. Hi, Warren. I have to say a quick hi to everybody. Meg, Warren, Anthony, Catherine, Kim. This is like what was the show where they would she would say romper room? Exactly. It's like romper room. I see Tarrant, I see Bev, I see Lynn. Christina, and thanks so much for your comments. I saw your one about your son. And yeah, so Tarrant, now you've been seen. Right. Hi, Craig. All right, everybody, have a wonderful evening. It's time to sign off.